Jesus said, "You are the light of the world." Matthew 5:14. Jesus spoke those words to his disciples as they gathered around him one day as he sat down to teach. He was saying, "You, my little band of followers, you are the light of the world." And he actually said it, "You are the light of the world." Matthew wrote in Greek, and if you read it in the Greek, you see several ways that "you" is emphasized. You are the light of the world. This one teacher's little handful of disciples are the light of the world. It could seem near presumption for Jesus to say those words, and even more for Matthew to record them. This little band being the light of the world. And then we remember they indeed have been seen through the whole world. People all over the world know their names, have read what they said and did. Many voices today declare a testimony of how the disciples' message changed their life. We even have books today making a case that the message these disciples carried changed history. Many distinctive values that we now today take for granted, we just think, well, yeah, that value is self-evident. But they weren't. They rather can be traced to these disciples' message that they gave. One author says, at one time, equality was unthinkable, compassion undesirable, and consent unimportant. But we today just assume, yes, everybody should hold to and honor those values. Well, what has led us to assume those values is the message that this little band of disciples carried to the world. And even more remarkable, some of the books that are saying that this is the case, that those values came from Christianity, are not written by Christians who we might think, could write them with an agenda, but even by atheists acknowledge that. Jesus knew that his disciples had been given an incredible light, and so he tells them to let that light shine. He talks about a city set on a hill. If a city, back in the days before you had electric lights all over the place, if a city was on the hill, its torches, its lamps, its fires would be seen for miles, penetrating the darkness. He also talks about people lighting a lamp, and he was thinking of the common oil lamp of his day. And that is not placed under a bowl, hiding its light, but it's placed on a lampstand, typically in that day, a protruding stone built into the wall. And the lamp sitting there would light the interior of the whole house there. Jesus says, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Let people see the splendor, the beauty of your life, of what you do. Jesus is not talking about the splendor of good words, because words can be cheap, as we know. When someone only hears words, the impact can be relatively superficial. So Jesus says, let your light shine that people may see your good deeds. Now, that's not ruling out a verbal witness. We do need words explaining our deeds. But the reason why those words have power is because of the works. The power of the spoken word lies in the demonstration of that word. My first years when I went to Corning, New York, I was in a voluntary service unit there. Voluntary service units are a group of young adults who the local church would place in a service assignment somewhere in the community as volunteers. And my assignment was to work with the church. But I also, one day a week, I was to go up to Corning Community College, a 2-year college, and encourage an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship chapter that was there. I would have lunch with students in the Commons, as well as attend the InterVarsity meeting. And when I was asked by other students, who I was, I would have fun describing the VS unit, the voluntary service unit that I was a part of, and our job assignments, because these were some young people not out for gain. We were volunteers. We got a living stipend of $25 a month to buy our toothpaste and stamps and soap, whatever. But we were there to serve. The students that I talked to were also intrigued by our living situation, a bunch of single adults living in a big house together. But because I could talk about our works, what we were doing, I would receive some respect. This was not just some religious nut with some elaborate mythology or whatever, but this was someone representing a life that they were attracted to. Let your light shine that people may see your good deeds. And I think the commands that immediately follow chapter 5, the first chapter of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, describe the kinds of works, the kinds of deeds that Jesus has in mind. Deeds of the conquest of anger, the conquest of lust, and of infidelity, as well as deeds where we avoid untrustworthiness. When we speak, our yes means yes and our no means no. Avoiding deeds of revenge, of hatred. And those kind of good deeds, especially that unusual love even of your enemies, they do shine bright. The message of Jesus that we forgive those who have hurt us. Dave told us that moving story of a man forgiving even the murder of the one close to him. That's powerful. And historians say that this message, and not just a message that they spoke, but that they lived, was what led the early church to grow at such a phenomenal rate. Alan Kreider, in his book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, says, the early Christians grew in number not because they won arguments, but because their life was, quote, distinctive and intriguing. It was their way of life more than their ideas that appealed to the majority of non-Christians who came to join them. And Jesus sees this coming, so he says to his disciples, you are the light of the world. One commentator says, you are universal history's most luminous fact. Now, where did this light come from? This light that the disciples had, that the whole world was going to be amazed by and drawn to. Did it come from their own wisdom? Did it come because they were so noble themselves? Well, when we look at the story that the Gospels tell about this little band, we see that they were ones who again and again would misunderstand things that Jesus was saying. They were ones who would, in a moment of great crisis, falter and fail. They would fall asleep when they should be watching. They would deny when they should confess. They were the most luminous bunch in history, not because they were so wise or they were so noble, but because they were disciples. Because they were following Jesus. They were listening to him. And they were trying to obey, at least stumbling toward following him. In the Gospel of John, Jesus calls himself the light of the world. John 8:12, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus says he's the light of the world. So then why would he say that the disciples are the light of the world? It's not a contradiction. It's a relationship. As the disciples follow Jesus, as they live like him, as they obey him, his light shines through them. He illumines them. And now they, like him, are the light of the world. How about you and I? Do we shine Jesus' light as we go throughout our week? Or is the only light that we have whatever feeble light we can come up with within ourselves? Are we following Jesus in our daily life? Are we taking our cues from him? Are we reading the Gospels to see how Jesus lived, to refresh ourselves, fill our minds with what he taught? Are we reading the letters of the Apostle Paul? We read him because he said, follow me as I follow Christ. He was part of that first generation, very close to Jesus, sort of unpacking what Jesus' teachings means in our life. Are we praying the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray? Your kingdom come, your will be done. Are we aligning ourselves with the way of Jesus? Or do we instead say, my kingdom come? Do I do what I want, even when Jesus is saying something different? Living for self, doing what I want rather than what Jesus wants, has always been hard for us to stop. And maybe other generations say this too, but I'm going to say I think it's harder for us to follow Jesus today in many ways. And in one of the main ways is that in years past, society around the church encouraged people to not be selfish. Society discouraged a self-focus. You were honored for doing what your community called you to do rather than what you wanted to do. Society expected you to do what God and tradition asked. But now, our society encourages you to do and be what yourself dictates you to do. Now society is aligned with self. We are told to look inward, not outward, for meaning, for direction. But that is so wrong. Our desires cannot serve as trustworthy guides. The road to a good life does not arise from within. It is Jesus who is the light of the world. Jesus has the wisdom to know the right way to live. I just read this article last week on the Gospel Coalition. Here's an example from an article. Imagine a sailor new to the ship and crew, confused as to where the ship is heading. It's nighttime and the ship's movements don't square with his training to use the North Star as a fixed reference point. So the confused sailor asks, "Captain, where are we going?" And the captain replies, "Well, we do things a little differently now. You see that lantern on the ship's bow? That is our guiding light. That's how we are making our way across the sea." And of course, no wonder the ship's movements don't make sense. Guiding a ship by a reference point on the ship means that that ship is adrift. It's voyaging to nowhere. Do not be that way, following your own light. Follow Jesus, the light of the world. Is that easy? Not at all. You and I need companions for that journey. We need persons to encourage us, to pray with us, to ask us accountability questions. We need to, as I said earlier, feast on the Gospels, fill our minds with Jesus' example, his instructions. And then as we follow Jesus, the beautiful qualities of his life are transmitted to our own. And his image is formed in us. And the light that the world saw in him now begins to be displayed in us. Dave mentioned the Tartaris, missionaries in Albania. Raphael Tartari was a pastor of the Mennonite Church in Lazia, Albania, where the Christian school is that many of us support. He's now planning a church in Skåder, I believe, which is a university town, and he's planning this church in a Muslim neighborhood. Well, I remember at a conference assembly many years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, there's always these mission stories that are told And to me, they're the high point of the conference assembly, not our delegate sessions, but those missional stories. And Raphael told one, and I should say that he and his wife Solange are ones that we as Trissels have adopted. Um, the monies that we were giving to Steve and Laura are now going to the Tartaris. And I should also say that they are going to be here one of the Sundays in August. I think this Sunday after our church retreat, perhaps. I don't know. One of the later ones. So he told this story that there was a 17-year-old young woman from a Muslim family who was worshiping with their church there in Malaysia. And she came up to him and said, "Could I be baptized?" And Raphael said, "Ask your parents." A year later, she came back and said, "Would you baptize me?" And he said, "The answer is the same." And she came back a little later and said, "It's a miracle. They said yes." And the reason was because they saw changes in her life that they liked. And they wanted to reinforce this direction they were seeing. Raphael says, after the baptism, her father shook my hand, thanking me who had helped his daughter change her religion. This little band here, my prayer is that as people look at our lives, they will be drawn by what they see. Not because we are so smart, we are so strong, so noble, but because we are following Jesus. You, this little band here, you are the light of the world, because in you, the world can see the light of the world. We have a tremendous opportunity to show how beautiful the way of Jesus is, so that people may glorify and praise our Father in heaven.